afternoon and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center. I am Shoshana Bryant, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. I'm happy to welcome many new people today to our series. I know a lot of our members think of us as only a foreign policy shop, but the JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policy. It's true we often spend our online hour doing defense and foreign stuff. I think we think of those as emergencies, things we have to tackle quickly, which is also true. But American education is America's future. And if it takes us 13 years to get kids from K through 12, we have to watch it all the way along. And if it requires rethinking the route from high school to productive adulthood, whether that's four-year college or two-year college or the military or apprenticeships, we have to watch that as well. So we're pleased to focus inwardly today, specifically on school choice. Before we get to our guest, Jason Bedrick, here is your JPC commercial. Well, actually, I already gave you half of the JPC commercial. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine In Focus Quarterly. The spring issue of In Focus is out and on the website. It's what we call the Issues issue, a series of mostly domestic policy priorities for Congress and the administration. And Jason Bedrick and his colleague Ian Kingsbury have a wonderful article in this issue on school choice. So please check it out, jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity, which is part of the story of school choice. In this series of calls, we've been very pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including various sides of China policy, Israel policy, including the fabulous growth of the Abraham Accords, and Iran policy, as well as American defense and the US Supreme Court. As you know, you are muted, but you can send questions during the presentation using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We're watching. And now our guest. Jason Bedrick's biography is really interesting. I learned that his favorite class was market-based education reform. He was his high school mascot, a cardinal, I think. And his favorite quote is, "Insert something profound here," by the ever-present Anonymous. Jason is the director of policy for EdChoice. In that role, he works with local organizations and state policymakers to develop high-quality education choice policies that will benefit as many students as possible. He reviews and provides feedback on legislation, leads policy briefings, provides expert testimony, writes op-eds, and conducts original research. Previously, Jason served as a policy analyst with the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. He was also a legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives and an education policy research fellow at the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. He received his master's degree in public policy from Harvard University. His thesis, Choosing to Learn, assessed tax credit scholarship programs operating in 8 states, including their design, their impact on student performance, fiscal impact, and popularity. I think we have a lot to learn. And Jason Bedrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I should also note that I went to a Catholic high school, so I was the first non-Catholic to receive the Religious Studies Award upon graduation. So there you have it.
I'm adding that.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to share my screen so that people have something to look at besides my face here. Just take a moment. There we go. And so what I want to talk about is America's educational choice moment. So as Shoshana mentioned, I am the director of policy at EdChoice. My organization is a nonprofit 501c3 founded by the Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman and his wife Rose 25 years ago with the mission of expanding educational choice all across the country. And this, frankly, has been a banner year for us. Just 10 years ago, the Wall Street Journal called 2011 the year of school choice because there were 13 states that had passed either new school choice programs or expanded existing ones. This year, one of my colleagues and I wrote an op-ed calling it the year of educational choice because I believe we are on track to pass more bills than we did in 2011. And they're also different in really two different ways. One, you note that I called it educational choice this time and not just school choice. Last time around, the bills were mostly vouchers or tax credit scholarships, which we'll get into what those mean in a minute. But those are primarily just for private school tuition. This year, a bunch of states are looking at education savings accounts, which can be used for a wide variety of expenditures, even outside of the traditional classroom. Another thing is that the bills this year tend to be much bigger and bolder. So whereas in the past, most of the bills were targeted just to low-income families or to students with special needs, and we still have some of those this year. This year, some of the bills are much more expansive or even universal. So here is the number of programs that are in existence. We see that actually the first programs were enacted in Maine and Vermont in the late 1800s, but most of the action has been since the 1990s when the modern school choice movement really kicked into high gear. First with the passage of the Milwaukee voucher, which was an effort that was a bipartisan effort. Governor Tommy Thompson was a Republican, and Polly Williams, who was an African-American Democrat in the state legislature at the time, worked together to pass that first voucher. And since then, there's been a real explosion in the number of programs, most of them in the last 10 to 15 years. Again, most of them are relatively small, targeted to specific disadvantaged populations. But over time, they are increasing in number and in expansiveness. So currently there are this is actually somewhat inaccurate because just yesterday, the Arkansas state legislature in both chambers passed a new tax credit scholarship. So it's actually, as soon as that is signed into law, 70 private school choice programs and policies operating in 33 states, serving more than 1.3 million families nationwide, or students anyway. Vouchers. So this is where the a voucher is like a coupon. So you get a portion of the funds that the state would have spent on your child, and you can take that to a private school. There are 15 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have a voucher program. Again, you can see that most of the growth has been over the last 10 to 15 years. And this year, like I said, there was an expansion in Arkansas also of their Succeed Scholarship Program, which is for students with special needs. They now include military families. Georgia expanded their special needs voucher as well, also pending the governor's signature. And Maryland, for the first time ever, has fully funded their voucher at $10 million. So we've got already 3 expansions of school voucher programs this year. Tax credit scholarships are somewhat different. Here, either individual taxpayers or corporations make a donation to a nonprofit scholarship organization. Those organizations then fund usually low and middle income families or students with special needs to pay private school tuition. As of yesterday, there are now 20 states that have a tax credit scholarship program serving more than 300,000 students nationwide. The largest is in Florida, where there's more than 100,000 students participating in the program. And you can see again, all of the growth has been really in the last 10 to 15 years. So this year, like I said yesterday, there's the new Arkansas program. Also, South Dakota expanded theirs. Like many states, there's something called a prior public requirement. That means that you have to go to a public school first in order to be eligible. They got rid of that, and so it opens it up for a lot more students in the state. But the real gold standard for educational choice programs are the education savings accounts, because these can not only be used for tuition, they can also be used for tutors, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, various types of special needs therapy. And unused funds can be rolled over from year to year. And in some states, you can even save unused funds all the way through to use in college. So this creates, it gives parents a lot more freedom and flexibility to customize their child's education, and also helps fight against tuition inflation, because there's a wide variety of different places that you can use it. And schools are not only competing against each other and these non-school options, they're also competing against savings. So it helps keep prices down. These are relatively new. The first ESA program was actually enacted exactly 10 years ago in 2011, and that was in Arizona. Most of these states, I should mention, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida, are only for students with special needs. Arizona started that way, but has since expanded their program to include a number of other categories, including students who are assigned to a public school that is rated D or F on their A through F rating system, students that are on a Native American reservation where the schools are notoriously bad, also children of active duty military personnel or military killed in the line of duty, kids who have been adopted through the foster care system, etc. Kentucky and West Virginia were just adopted this year, and so we'll get into that. Kentucky is the nation's first tax credit funded ESA. The eligibility is 100%, 175% of the free and reduced lunch program. So it's a little more than 300% of the federal poverty line, or about $86,000 for a family of four. And they get about $4,600 in their ESA. It is a relatively limited program, though, only $25 million in tax credits. So we're talking about probably around 5,000 students who will be able to participate, at least initially. West Virginia, though, has the most expansive educational choice program in the nation. All students who are switching out of a public school or who are entering kindergarten are eligible. And after a few years, that prior public requirement goes away. So in a few years, every single child in West Virginia is going to be eligible for an ESA. Also, the value there is about $4,600. I suspect we may have a lot of families or people listening who live in, let's say, New York, New Jersey, California, where the prices are sky high. You should know that in places like Kentucky and West Virginia, this almost covers the average elementary school tuition. It's a little below what you would get for private school tuition for high school, which is it's a little closer to like 8 to 10 grand. But this actually goes a long way in those states. I should mention that in New York City, the schools are spending about $31,000 per pupil. The national average is about $16,000. The other thing about West Virginia is that it's formula funded, which means that every single child who is eligible actually will receive an ESA. There is funding for it in the bill. There's also a whole bunch of bills that are still pending and active. We don't expect that every single one of these is going to pass. And actually, there's a lot more than just what I showed you here. These are just the ones that actually have a decent shot of passing. As a matter of fact, the Montana, I think it's their House Revenue Committee, is meeting today on their expanded tax credit scholarship. Actually, they're meeting right now as we speak, and they should be voting on that. Later this afternoon, the Minnesota Senate is expected to pass a budget that includes a new universal ESA along party lines. So there is a lot of action going on this year. And we are still on track, I would say, to beat 2011 to make it the year of educational choice. So one question is, why now? Obviously, coronavirus has a lot to do with it. Why? Well, look, you had a lot of parents, and this is a survey that we did in September of 2020, just around the back to school, who are saying, yeah, I'm really concerned about my kid getting exposed to coronavirus at school. On the other hand, I'm also concerned about my child missing instruction time, and I'm concerned about missing work if my child's school is closed. And so most families actually wanted to have multiple learning options available for their children. And they realized that sometimes what they wanted, what their neighbor wanted, was not the same, right? So there were all these school closures. Even this one was from March. big division in terms of people that were comfortable returning to school versus those who were uncomfortable having their kids go to school. And so if your school is open for business and there is no remote option and you're in the uncomfortable category, you are not happy. If you're in the very comfortable category, but your school is closed, you're also not happy. So families started to realize, you know what, maybe a system where everybody is assigned to one school is not the best system, and we need multiple options. And you can see this too, that from May 2020 to March 21, you had, it was going up and down, especially when the numbers, when COVID cases rose in the late fall, early winter. Parents were less comfortable, now more comfortable. And you can see that the private schools and the public district schools operated very differently, right? A plurality of both had in-person, both in-person and online. But if you look at the private schools were much more likely to be open in person, right? You had more than 80% that were either totally open in person or open in person and online. Whereas the district schools were more than twice as likely as the private schools to be remote only. And so you had a whole bunch of families that were moving to private schools. We've actually seen two things. On the one hand, we've seen a lot of school closures. On the other hand, we've actually seen private school enrollments increase. So it really depended. I think with the school closures, a lot of those were Catholic schools that were tending to, a large number of poor families that all of a sudden just weren't able to pay tuition. Many of these were already on shaky financial ground. Those ended up closing. But those who were able to weather the storm got an influx of middle and upper middle income families that were looking for, their child to be educated in an actual physical school. We also saw the rise of I shouldn't say the rise of the teachers' unions. What the parents recognized is that the teachers' unions had a lot more power than they thought. In cases where parents wanted the schools to open, but the teachers' unions wanted the schools to stay closed and were making all sorts of demands, in many cases, those schools ended up staying closed and against the wishes of parents who were very, very frustrated. And so you see that when Americans are asked about how they approve of public officials and their performance relative to the closing or reopening of schools, fewer than half of Americans say that the local teachers unions or that the national teachers unions, that they're satisfied with their performance. And if we look here, this is a question of whether teachers are acting in the best interests of everybody, or if they are essentially a special interest group. We do see that school parents tend to give teachers the benefit of the doubt, but there are some splits. So Republicans are almost exactly split in half on this issue. Democrats much more favorable toward the teachers unions, and independents are somewhere in between. And finally, because of Corona, parents got a peek inside their child's classroom in a way that they never did before. I don't have data on this, but anecdotally, there seems to be a lot of concern about the politicization of the classroom, teachers' political views being forced on the children, not just, asking the children to think critically about, hot button issues of the day, but actually crossing the line over into indoctrination. And there's also been some serious concerns about quality. So for example, this is a study from Education Next, which is run by groups at Harvard and Stanford. Pretty much across the board, everyone felt that during coronavirus, there was less learning going on. But in the private schools, fewer than 10% said that there was a lot less going on, whereas more than 20% in both charters and public district schools said that there was a lot less learning going on. So the private schools tended to be doing a better job, which makes sense given that the private schools were much more likely to be open than the private schools. So when you put all these different factors together, what do you get? Well, you get increasing support for school choice. But really, that's been a trend that we've seen at least since 2017. So support for educational choice policies have already been going up, but they have been going up even further now. So parents of children of school age are now 80% in support of education savings accounts, obviously much higher support among private school parents. If you do break this down also by ethnicity, so this is all Blacks, right? This is all Hispanics. But if you look at Black parents and Hispanic parents, it's actually north of 80%. It's closer to 85% support. So there is just a tremendous amount of support. It's also not just the level of support, because I mean, you look here, there was quite a bit of support, right, in 2017, 18, and 19. It's also that these families who are supportive are much more likely today to be actively engaged on the issue. So we're hearing from legislators that we're working with all across the country that they are hearing more from their constituents, from parents looking for alternative options than they ever have been before. And we hope that we can capitalize on this and keep these parents engaged going forward. So thank you very much for your time, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jason. We do have questions, and I'm going to take the first one. You wrote, I grew up in a home where education was paramount. I was also fortunate that my parents could afford to live in a suburb with great public elementary school, and so on and so forth. There are two thoughts in that comment: what your parents did and what the schools did. So what happens when you have parents that either don't have the skills to enhance their child's education or don't care to do that, or secondarily, if parents don't understand what their options are? How do you get to parents that perhaps, unlike yours, and I know unlike mine, may be lost and think, look, the only thing I've got here is public school. I'm sending my kid to public school because what do I know? How do you help them?
Sure. So there's no one policy that's a panacea. There's no one policy that's going to make all parents into better parents. What I will say is this: I think driving this concern is this idea that, well, if we enact, universal school choice, what's going to happen? All the families that are the most engaged in education are then going to leave the system. They're going to go to a private school. The existing system is then going to be forced to educate the most difficult to educate children, and they are going to have less money to do it, and the system is going to collapse, right? What we've actually seen is the exact opposite, which is there are 27 studies that look at the effect of school choice programs on the performance of students in public schools. So again, not the participants, the ones who remain in the public schools. 25 out of 27 find statistically significant positive effects. One finds no difference. One found small negative effects, but that was a study in Florida. And we've got, there were like half a dozen other studies in Florida that found positive effects. So it was probably just a false negative. Looking at Florida, actually, Florida is the largest program in the country. Like I mentioned before, more than 100,000 students. They're all low income or have special needs. There's a longitudinal study, I believe it is Florida State University does every single year. And what they find is it's not the cream of the crop that's leaving. Actually, when you take the students that are entering the program for the first time and you compare them to their demographic peers, they score lower on average before they enter the program. Meaning the students who are doing well in the existing system tend to just stay there. It's the students that are struggling that have families that are more likely to take them out of the system. And so those students after a few years are thriving and outperforming their demographic peers. So in other words, school choice is the rising tide that lifts all boats. So even if we can't, get parents to be better parents just with this particular policy, they still benefit by the increased competition. Their children are now going to go to schools that are better performing.
Thank you. A question from a listener. There appears to be wide agreement in the US that political polarization is one of our most urgent problems. How do we reconcile this with the fact that specialized private or religious schools could also act as echo chambers for like-minded groups rather than enhancing the diversity and enhancing the spread of conversation?
Yeah, this is the balkanization argument. I think that right now, what we do is we force parents to fight over having their values represented in the public school system. And we are a free and pluralistic society. Our education system should reflect that. Everybody, as adults, are ultimately going to be exposed to all different types of views. But for those formative years, I think what's important first is that we develop particular attachments to our community before we grow up and then are exposed to the broader world. There is a lot of research that shows, and you can go to our website, edchoice.org. We compile all of this research. There was also a study put out a few years ago by Dr. Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas called Civics Exam. You can find that at the Education Next website, that looks at this question of political tolerance, okay? And what it finds is actually that the private schools outperform the public schools in instilling political tolerance in their students. And what do I mean by political tolerance? How do we measure that? Well, what you do is you give a whole bunch of different organizations and you ask the person taking this test to identify the one they like least. So you'll be happy to know that the KKK is the least liked group in America. But what you do is you then ask, do you believe that members of this group should have the right to vote? Should they have the right of free speech? Should they have the right to publicly assemble? Should they have the right to run for office? Interestingly, among Hispanics, the least liked group is LGBTQ activists. Now, you might think that a lot of Hispanic children go to Catholic schools. And you might think, given the Catholic school's teachings, that there would be less political tolerance expressed by Catholics towards LGBTQ activists. In fact, the reverse is true. The Hispanic students that went to Catholic schools were more likely to express political tolerance to that group than their public school peers. And that's all across the board, right? So when we are in a system where I can go to a school that represents that instills my children with my values, and you also have the freedom to do the same thing, that I think actually leads to a more tolerant and peaceful society where we can coexist, rather than sending them all to a system where either you're fighting over whose values are represented, or you end up not teaching any values, not teaching any character formation whatsoever, because it's the least common denominator.
I hadn't thought about it as least common denominator. We have a couple of related questions, and so I'm going to throw them all together for you.
Sure.
First is, how would, for example, a Jewish exit from the public schools over anti-Semitism prevent the spread of anti-Semitism in those schools? Does leaving make things worse? And then a broader question. A listener wrote about a school board that adopted the program of Ibrahim Kendi that separates people into the Black and Hispanic community on one side and white and Asian on the other side. If parents with more, let's say, Martin Luther King-ish views leave, will we create little enclaves for the Kendis of the world and kids that get that stuff? So it's a stay versus go. How do we do that?
That's a good question. I'll take the first one first, and then you'll probably have to remind me of the second one.
Okay.
So in terms of the Jewish question, yeah, that is a question. That is a question. We'll have to see how that plays out. But I would say this first of all. There was a study by my co-author of the Jewish Policy Center piece, Ian Kingsbury, conducted a study. It was published actually with Jay Green and the American Enterprise Institute a few years ago, looking at anti-Semitism in public versus private schools. And they found that the public school graduates were significantly more likely to express anti-Semitic views than private school graduates. So just overall, having a system where more non-Jews are going to private school seems like that is actually going to be better for the Jews. Another thing is this: having an exit option does not mean that you have to use it. A part of the reason that you want an exit option is because it enhances your voice. So part of the piece that we wrote talked about the research of Albert O. Hirschman, who talked about, when you have an institution that is failing, or an institution that is no longer representing the views of its members, how do you fix that institution? And he talked about two primary ways of doing that: exercising exit or voice. So let's say you have just a pizza parlor that has new management, and they change the recipes and they lower the quality, right? You can either go to the manager and complain, or you can stop going there, right? So the question is, in which type of organization is A or B more effective? Well, one thing that he learned over time is actually that if you have no exit option, then your voice is actually also diminished. So when you go to your local school board and you say, hey, we don't like that you're, adopting this crazy curriculum here, this isn't good. If they know that you have nowhere else to go, then they can tell you to go pound sand, right? But if they know that if they don't listen to you, that you can leave and you can take the public dollars assigned to your child with you and go somewhere else, now you are in a much better position to have them listen to your voice and not actually have to exercise the exit option. But of course, if you're in a situation where the system is just doing crazy things and you feel that your child is, not in an environment that is, conducive for their, educational well-being, you want to have that exit option as an escape hatch right away. So we actually think that by giving an exit option, we are not abandoning the public school system. Most children are still going to be educated in the public school system in this country, and we still have to engage and we still have to fight there. But your voice is going to be enhanced if you're able to leave.
So that's the net effect of the charts that you showed us about savings plans and funding by the government for the child rather than the school,
Right.
is to enhance the voice of the parents. So one reason, I guess, when people say they want charter schools or they want public charter schools, they want the money to follow the student. That's really what gives the parents power to say,
right.
I don't like what you're doing, and if you don't fix it, then I'll leave.
That's right. That's why we are seeing improvements in the system. Like I can tell you, I'm out here in Arizona. I've got some things right here even, actually. So this is something that I got from Tempe Union. Okay, so this is a local public school system. It's telling me about their report card. Look, right? They're all, they've got A ratings. Look at all these amazing programs that they have. Why is my public school advertising? Right? People, oh, it's a waste of money that a public institution should be advertising. Well, they're advertising because people are going to leave. Right? You've got all these other schools telling you, here are the interesting programs that we have. We've got international baccalaureates. We've got a fencing team. We teach Latin. We teach the core knowledge curriculum. Well, now the public schools have to say, oh, wait a second, we better be listening to what it is that parents want and provide that and step up our performance. Otherwise, they're going to leave. This is one of the reasons I think that actually Arizona, which has the most robust educational choice system in the country. And what I mean by that is we have the most charter schools per capita in the country. 20% of kids are in charter schools. We have the most private educational options in the country. More than 5%, actually closer to 7% of kids in the state are now in some sort of either education savings account or tax credit scholarship. We also have interdistrict choice. So there's more than 30% of kids that are using interdistrict choice. So attending a public school that they're not zoned to. So that means a majority of kids in the state are actually attending a school other than the one that they are assigned to. And that I believe is the primary reason that over the last 2 decades, Arizona has had the most gains on the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the nation's report card. Having such a high choice environment, having all of these different options in this competition has really forced the public system to improve.
So you just answered another one of the questions that we had, which is, how can you measure some of this? So you have this national report card, and Arizona works out to do very well at it. Yep. Do you have other insights for us about states that have school choice and how they do on this national assessment?
Yeah, Arizona, Florida is another one, Indiana. There was a recent report, I'm forgetting the name, but it just came out from Jay Green, Patrick Wolf, and Matthew Ladner, published by the University of Arkansas, which again is actually one of the top education policy outfits in the country. I know it sounds strange, it's the University of Arkansas, but you may have heard of this group called the Walton Foundation, connected to Walmart. They are based in Arkansas, and they poured a ton of money to attract the top talent. So all these folks are, Harvard PhDs and whatnot. They have a really fantastic education policy shop there, do a lot of great research. And what they did is they looked at the NAEP and the gains over the last 20 years. And they also rated each state based on the what they call the Education Freedom Index, which includes a number of factors, but it's heavily weighted toward private school choice and public school choice, so charters and interdistrict choice. And what they found was that there was a very strong correlation between educational freedom and improvements on the NAEP. Which is what you would expect, right? Now, that doesn't mean Arizona is number one in the country. It's not in actual levels, but Arizona went from pretty close to the bottom to above average over 20 years. And so it's the gains that you're looking at. And if you look just at Arizona's charter sector, in its actual level, it is outperforming Massachusetts and New Hampshire, which are the top two states. What's the difference? Well, Massachusetts and New Hampshire have majority white populations. Arizona is majority minority, and we spend less than half as much per pupil. So it really is phenomenal. I've said a lot about test scores. I should mention test scores are an important measure, right? They're, especially math and English, they are relatively objective. We like to measure them because they are measurable, but it's not the most important thing about schools. So just looking out here at the schools in Arizona, like I mentioned, it's not just that they're competing on their performance, they're competing on all these extracurriculars, they're competing on a variety of different areas. And it's also about pluralism. It's about, having your values expressed in school. Schooling is about a lot more than just math and reading scores. Those are very important. But, at the end of the day, education is about passing on your culture. It's about continuing civilization. So that means passing on your values, your history, knowledge about, who are we? What is our purpose in this world, both as individuals and as a community? It is a lot easier to do that kind of thing in a private school environment than it is in a public school environment.
But that, on the other hand, would work the other way for people who are promoting less inclusive, less comfortable, less. So you have to worry about the other side of this, which is people who segregate their kids for purposes of cutting them off from the larger society.
It's true. It is true. But I think ultimately that ends up being the price of freedom, is that people are going to be free to do things that we disagree with. Our freedom to do what we want means that they have the freedom to do what they want to.
Okay, so you're looking at preponderance here. I mean,
yeah.
If the vast majority of kids are in places that are better for them, and the price of that is some kids are in places that we would say, or some people would say, are not so good for them.
Right.
We have a series of questions about unions. People had a lot of things to say about unions. I'm going to try to put them together.
Sure.
First part, do you believe that teachers' unions have been weakened by the pandemic lockdowns? Is there any movement in the Democratic Party to change teachers' unions, since in all of the large cities, they're working against Democratic mayors and Democratic legislatures that have tried to open schools and have found it difficult? Third is, are there any significant public elected officials out there willing to take on the teachers' union?
Okay. The second two questions are not my area of expertise. So
Okay.
I'll punt on both of those and, ask a poli-sci major or something. But
you can do that.
On the first one, though, have the teachers' unions been weakened? It's very context specific. So in some states, yes, and in some states, no. I think across the board, they have tended to overplay their hand, but in some places, they're going to bounce back faster than in others. You look at West Virginia and Kentucky. Okay, these are the two states really where the Red for Ed movement began a few years ago, where they had massive teacher, walkouts and sickouts, and they were essentially on strike, but just not calling it that, right? There were a lot of Republicans. I mean, both those states have Republican majorities that were just terrified of the political repercussions. Well, they actually didn't pay any political repercussions. As a matter of fact, they expanded their majorities. In West Virginia, they had a Republican supermajority for the first time ever. This was a huge miscalculation for the unions to do that. You may notice around the country, people think that this is a left-right issue, school choice. It's really not. Both the Republican coalition and the Democratic coalition have constituencies that are for or against school choice. So on the Democratic side, when you poll African Americans and Hispanics, they are overwhelmingly in favor of school choice. And when we've had bipartisan coalitions, it's usually some white suburban Republican and some Black or Hispanic urban Democrat that are working together to get a bill passed. It's the white suburban Democrats that are very much against school choice and that have close ties with the teachers unions, but the teachers unions are very, very powerful in the Democratic coalition. Among Republicans, though, in rural areas, very often the public schools are the single largest employer. And so the public school superintendents wield tremendous power, over rural Republican legislators. So in years past, we've tended as a movement to have most success in purple states, right? Think of it this way. In a blue state, the unions, and it's not just the unions, it's the school superintendents, it's the school boards association, it's the school administrators association, right? They get in bed with the Democrats and they can usually block reform. In a purple state, they also tend to get in bed with the Democrats, but when the Republicans every now and again take control, they feel no loyalty. The Republicans feel no loyalty to the public school establishment, and they are willing to pass these sorts of reforms. In the red states, the Democrats, the public school establishment is not stupid. They're not going to get in bed with the Democrats, which is when they have a rump party. So what they do is they use their they play in the Republican primaries. They use their connections with the rural Republicans, and they can often block reform. That's why if you look around the country, Utah, Mississippi, Missouri, right? You would think these states would have broad school choice programs, but they don't. Well, here the teachers unions basically in these states sided with the Democrats. They tried to make the Republicans pay a price in the election. It didn't work. It backfired, and all of a sudden, the Republicans said, well, we owe you nothing anymore, and we're willing to pass school choice programs. So yes, in a number of states like that, I think they have overplayed their hand, and that's one of the reasons I think we're actually going to have the biggest year for educational choice that we've ever had yet.
So a question relating to that, are there statistics yet, maybe it's too early, on numbers or percentages of kids who have left the public school system, let's say in 2020 and 2021, pandemic related, across the country? Do we know these things?
Yes, but not for the whole country yet, because different states have different reporting deadlines and guidelines, and some have reported and some haven't. And in some states, there's like tens of thousands of quote unquote missing kids, which just means the parents may have taken the kids out of the public school, so they're not showing up, but they didn't file any paperwork with the public school to say they're doing it. And we don't know where these kids are. Do they go to private school? Are they homeschooling? Are they in a pod? In Florida, every now and then I'll see a report saying, oh, they found another 10,000 kids. Like they're actually going out and trying to contact these families and figure out where they went. So that is a very, very good question. A lot of people in the research community are interested. And one of the questions is, how many of these families that disappeared or kids that disappeared are just out because of the pandemic and they're going to be coming back, and how many are gone for good because they may not have wanted to leave in the first place, but once they left, they found something they liked better, and so now they're staying. We really don't know yet. It's too soon to tell. These sorts of data usually lag by a few years, but we are all very much anticipating finding the answer to that question.
So I can see doctoral theses being written on what happened to those kids in the pandemic.
I am sure there'll be.
But you think we're not close to figuring that out yet?
Not yet.
Futures problem?
Yep.
So we're coming to the end of our program, and people who tune in regularly or even periodically know that I like to end the program with a question that allows the speaker to say something positive so that we end on an up. You have not been particularly negative. So, sometimes in foreign policy, it's all sort of black and we have to dig for a positive note. Say something positive, Jason. In terms of American education, I know that there are people who think that we're done, we're finished, we're never going to be the educational leader that we probably ought to be. Can we make all this up? Can we fix what happened to us in the pandemic and maybe come out better?
I think so. First of all, even though we've not been an educational leader for a long, long time, we are still a leader when it comes to innovation. So maybe our system is not producing kids that are, like the Chinese, doing really well on math and reading tests, but maybe there are some other things that we are not measuring that we are doing a good job of, especially in the area of creative thinking. Ideally, I think you would try to marry the two, but I think that the kids are going to be all right. Also, I am very optimistic about the direction of the school choice movement. Anytime we lose, those losses are temporary. But when we win, those gains are permanent. The only times that they've been able to reverse a gain is through the courts, and that is happening with increasingly less frequency, especially with I think the Espinoza decision last year it's going to make it very difficult for the courts to stop us. Plus, there's been a massive shift in the courts over the last 2 decades. And legislatively, once we have a program in place, they have never successfully legislatively repealed a program. We end up having a constituency that is willing to fight for that program. So I think over time, there's going to be more and more educational choice, and we see that those lead to improved outcomes. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the future. On the values question, I think there may be some room for pessimism. We saw this, California is absolutely massive, and they are a leader in the nation because a lot of textbooks that are used all across the country are written according to the California standards because they're such a massive market. They just adopted this ethnic studies curriculum that frankly is anti-Semitic, as we spelled out in the piece, even in its final version. So that is, I think, room for worry. But I do think that school choice is one way that we can fight back against that.
Maybe that is a good and optimistic ending. I want to thank you for being with us. This has been eye-opening and really interesting. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and to the woman who asked, can you please share the presentation? Yes. So I'll end on a positive note. This presentation is being recorded. It will be on the JPC website, and we hope that you will share it. We will share it also. And we look forward to having you back with us next week when we have Seth Cropsey from the Hudson Institute, and we are going to return to a slightly more familiar pattern. We're going to talk about China and the Pacific Ocean. Jason Bedrick, thank you for a great lunch hour.
Thank you for having me.